In this video, we're going to be looking at biological rhythms. We're basically going to be asking the question, how does your body know what time it is? So if we just have a look at the specification, we're going to be breaking these videos down into three, just because there's quite a lot of information, and I just want to make sure that you're able to fully engage. So in this video, we're going to be looking at an overview of biological rhythms and focusing really on circadian rhythms. We'll then look in the next video at infradian and ultradian rhythms. And then the final video, we'll be looking at the effects of endogenous pacemakers and exogenous zeitgebers. So there is a lot to come. All right, so when we're talking about biological rhythms, we are referring to the distinct patterns of change in the body activity that conforms to cyclical time periods. And we're going to be looking at those different time periods when we look at the different types of biological rhythms here. So all living organisms are subject to these rhythms. And they influence a lot of things about us. They influence the release of hormones, they influence our mood, our eating and digestion, our sleep, our coordination, and as we'll discover, even how well drugs are absorbed by the body. These biological rhythms are influenced by two things. They are influenced by endogenous pacemakers. These are our internal body clocks, inverted commas, and exogenous zeitgebers, these external environmental changes. Now, there are numerous biological rhythms. In the spec, we're just going to be focusing on a few. So we're going to be looking at ultradian rhythms. These are biological rhythms that occur many times in a day, i.e. each rhythm is shorter than 24 hours. We're going to be looking at infradian rhythms. These occur, they take more time than a day to repeat. So, or I should say less than a day. So they could take days or weeks or months. And then we're going to be looking in this video at circadian rhythms. These last about a day. They last roughly 24 hours. But there are also other ones like circannual rhythms, for example, which take much, much longer. These take about a year to repeat in that cycle. Okay, so just a heads up, we're going to be using those terms endogenous pacemakers and exogenous zeitgebers. We're going to go into these in much more detail in the third video in this series. So bear in mind that we will cover these in much, much more detail, but we're going to be using them also throughout these videos, so it's important that we introduce them now. Endogenous pacemakers. Endogenous refers to the internal body clocks that regulate biological rhythms. We're going to be looking at one really key endogenous pacemaker, the SCN, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus. We'll look at where that's located and we'll look at its function in the sleep-wake cycle later on, but we'll be referring to it here. We're also going to be talking about exogenous zeitgebers, external cues. These help to entrain, or these affect or keep in line, I guess, our biological rhythms. So our main exogenous zeitgeber is light, and we'll be looking at the effect of light on entraining our circadian rhythm. So I just want you to think about biological rhythms that perhaps last about a day, a circadian rhythm. I want you to think about biological rhythms that perhaps last longer than a day, infradian rhythms, and those that repeat more than once a day, ultradian rhythms. So let's start with circadian rhythms. Circa meaning about, and diem, i.e. carpe diem, is a day. So these rhythms are lasting about a day. They're subject to around a 24-hour cycle. We have hundreds of different circadian rhythms. We're going to be looking just at two, the sleep-wake cycle and core body temperature. This is such an interesting area of research. There's a whole field called chronobiology, which is just about the study of circadian rhythms. And so it is a huge, huge area, and we are really just scratching the surface of it here. All right, so let's have a look first of all at core body temperature. Core body temperature peaks at about 37.4 degrees in the late afternoon, around 6 p.m. And its lowest is about 36.5 or so. Here it looks a little bit lower in the early hours of the morning. So it's kind of its lowest at around 4 a.m. and it's highest around 6 p.m. generally. There's some really interesting research in the field of chronobiology. Some key findings are that we perform cognitively better when we are warmer. So adults perform better on IQ tests at around 7 p.m. than around 9 a.m. We know that children who are read stories show superior recall and comprehension when they read that story at around 3 p.m. than when they read the story at 9 a.m. So ideally, you want to be sitting exams in the afternoon. We are at our cognitive peak later on in the day as opposed to the morning. So that's just some of the really cool research that's coming out of the field of chronobiology. The other key circadian rhythm we're going to be looking at is the sleep-wake cycle. We feel drowsy at night and we feel awake during the day. And that's really no coincidence. But why is it not the other way around? Why is it that we feel drowsy when it's dark and awake when it's light? The sleep-wake cycle really shows the importance of daylight, this key exogenous zeitgeber, in training our biological rhythm, our circadian rhythm, our sleep-wake cycle. But our sleep-wake cycle is also heavily influenced by our internal biological clock, our suprachiasmatic nucleus. So what happens when our biological clock is left to its own devices without any external influences? What happens when we leave it free running? And how do we determine whether the sleep-wake cycle depends mainly on endogenous pacemakers or exogenous factors? Well, we need to study people where we've removed any of these external factors. And this typically involves caves and bunkers without light. So let's take a look at the most famous study of this kind. And this is Siffre's famous cave study. His name is pronounced Siffre. He's a French caveman. That was his job. And he spent really long periods of time underground to study his own biological rhythm. So he spent periods from sort of 2 to 6 months underground. The caves were warm, they were dry, but he had no natural light. There were no clocks, but he had access to food, he had access to water, he was monitored via computers and video cameras, and he had a 24-hour phone link to the surface. He was given things to occupy his time, like books and exercise equipment and that kind of thing. So they looked at his sleep-wake cycle. At first, there didn't seem to be a clear pattern in his sleep-wake cycle. His sleep and awake periods were fairly random. But eventually, he settled on around a 25-hour sleep-wake cycle. Each day, he was waking up about an hour later. And by the end, he had lost a considerable number of days. When he came out of the cave after 2 months in mid-September, he thought that it was mid-August. So each day he was losing an hour, and that added up over the time that he was in the cave. But essentially, he settled on a 25-hour rhythm. He continued to fall asleep and wake up on a regular basis. So for us, this shows real evidence of a sleep-wake cycle. It shows that this endogenous pacemaker is really strong. It shows that it is probably slightly longer than 24 hours, though. So that means that for us, our sleep-wake cycle must be entrained by exogenous zeitgebers that last 24 hours. So things like light, maybe social cues like meal times, for example, help to entrain or help to enforce our sleep-wake cycle as a 24-hour cycle, despite the fact that if left free running, it perhaps might settle on 25 hours. So it shows really the importance of the interaction between our endogenous pacemakers, that SCN, and the exogenous zeitgebers, all of these external cues like light and meal times. Interestingly, just last year, 2021, they completed another study of this type. So they sent 15 men and women into the caves in the Pyrenees Mountains near Toulouse for 40 days to test the effects of deep time, which is quite a cool sounding study, I think. So the findings are yet to be published, but you can read a little bit more about it in a less formal sense online. All right, so let's evaluate these circadian rhythms. We're going to be looking at some supportive evidence about the effect of our sleep-wake cycle. We're going to be looking at individual differences in the sleep-wake cycle, and then we'll be looking at its application and utility in various areas. So starting with Siffre's cave study. Siffre's cave study provides really strong evidence about the influence of endogenous and exogenous factors We know that the sleep-wake cycle perhaps is around 25 hours, but it's entrained by external factors like light and meal times. However, we need to consider that actually Siffre had access to artificial light. Although he didn't have any natural light, he did have a lamp down there which allowed him to kind of go about his business. And this may have acted as a confounding variable in the same way that, you know, they say don't look at your devices before bedtime. Despite the fact that that is not natural light, that is still perhaps influencing our circadian rhythm. So perhaps this acts as a confounding variable and means that we can't really make clear conclusions about the effect of endogenous and exogenous factors in the sleep-wake cycle. We also have other research involving, I think it was Swedish, participants that were put into a World War II bunker study. So they were kept in there for a period of 4 weeks, again, deprived of any natural light. All but one of the participants in this study settled on a sleep-wake cycle between 24 and 25 hours. This tells us that, again, like Siffre, the sleep-wake cycle may be longer than 24 hours, but is going to be entrained by exogenous site keepers. So lots of evidence here about the sleep-wake cycle being around 24 to 25 hours, but entrained and kept in line to 24 hours by exogenous site keepers. However, and this is where we're going to turn our attention to individual differences. One participant in this bunker study had a sleep-wake cycle of 29 hours, which really highlights our next point, is that we are making sweeping generalizations about the sleep-wake cycle, and actually there are significant individual differences in the sleep-wake patterns. So if we just take a look, we know that they can vary significantly. People have preferences for their cycle, and we can't make universal laws about this. We had that one participant who settled on a 29-hour sleep-wake cycle, and we know that from other research and other case studies that actually circadian rhythms can vary from 13 hours to 65 hours. We also know, and I'll get you guys to do a little test on this yourselves so you can see where you fall. We know that we can categorize people as either larks or owls. So larks tend to be people who go to bed early and they wake up early. Owls, night owls, go to bed late and wake up late. And so we know that people have different preferences for when they go to bed and when they wake up, highlighting individual differences in circadian rhythms. We also know that our sleep-wake cycle changes dramatically across the lifespan. Our chronotype, or our sleep pattern, is unique for our stage of life. And we can see here not just the hours of sleep, but we'll have a look at sort of the proportions of deep sleep versus REM sleep, which changes throughout the lifespan as well. So there is an argument, actually, that we need to change the school day. In adolescence, our sleep-wake cycle shifts forward by 2 hours, which means that teenagers want to go to bed later and want to wake up later as an effect of their biology. It's not them being lazy or rebellious. It is genuinely what is happening to their sleep-wake cycle. So feel free to write a letter to Mr. Jones requesting a 10 a.m. start. So what's the problem here? Well, the fact that there are such individual differences means that we can really only discuss research data in terms of averages, which might be fairly meaningless. These individual differences pose a little bit of a problem for us because it may be really difficult to generalize any of those findings, particularly when we're looking at single-person case studies or even like really small samples. Sorry, writing his name like it's pronounced there. So we need to just be mindful of this. These studies typically involve very small samples or even individual cases. And finally, I just want to end on practical applications. Our understanding of circadian rhythms has been really, really influential in 2 key areas, in terms of our understanding of shift work and also in terms of improving medical treatments, in particular drug therapy. By understanding circadian rhythms, we're able to understand the adverse effects of desynchronization. You will have experienced these effects yourself. If ever you've been on an international flight where you've crossed time zones traveling internationally, then you will have felt the effects of desynchronization. You will have felt jet lag. And it can absolutely wipe you out. You end up on a beautiful beach on the other side of the world, and all you want to do is sleep during the day. This tiredness and lethargy is due to this desynchronization. It's your endogenous pacemaker, your internal body clock, being out of sync with external factors. Your body is saying it's nighttime and needs to sleep, but outside the sun is shining. And that desynchronization makes you feel absolutely horrendous. It is worse if you're traveling east. That's because you are losing time, essentially, and therefore you're losing sleep. So your body is going to suffer even further from the jet lag. But anyway, going back to the point, understanding circadian rhythms has allowed us to understand the effects of desynchronization, and we can apply this to shift work. People who work night shift, for example, and therefore need to sleep to the day, suffer accidents at work. We know that there is reduced concentration. We know that cognitive performance is at its lowest at 6 a.m. And this means that mistakes and accidents happen. And people lose their lives because of this. There's really interesting research looking at when the clocks change, when we go to daylight savings and back again. On the night where we lose an hour of sleep because the clocks go forward, there are far more accidents in the early morning following that clock change than at any other time of the year because of that sleep deprivation, because of the effects of this desynchronization. We know that shift workers are 3 times more likely to develop heart disease. That heart disease is linked to the stress of having to adjust to new sleep-wake cycles. That increase in heart disease is linked to poor quality sleep during the day. Our body does not want to sleep when it's light, and they have no choice but to sleep at that time. And so shift workers are far more likely to suffer from some really severe health consequences. Therefore, research into circadian rhythms has economic implications. We're talking about productivity here. We're also talking about health effects and perhaps the economic consequences for the NHS in having to then deal with these health issues as a consequence of shift work. But, all of this research is correlational. And we know that correlation does not equal causation. There may be other factors. There may be some of these third variables or intervening variables that are affecting our ability to draw conclusions here. It may be that the link between shift work and the health consequences is not a direct effect. It may be that there are other variables that are leading to both. For example, people who work shift work might have difficulties with relationships. Being out of sync with your partner and not being able to invest time into sort of nurturing that relationship may lead to the health consequences and is a consequence of their shift work. Likewise, there could be marital strain associated with missing family events. If you're out of sync with your children, with your wife or your partner or your husband, then this shift work is not directly leading to the consequences, but this shift work is creating strain, which then leads to the health consequences. So the point I'm making here is that it might not be the biological factors that create the adverse consequences associated with shift work. We have to consider these third variables. And finally, our understanding of circadian rhythms has helped to improve medical treatments and drug therapy. Circadian rhythms regulate a number of the body's basic processes. Circadian rhythms regulate things like heart rate, digestion, hormones, and because of this, research has shown that there are particular points in the day where drugs are going to be most effective. There is a field dedicated to understanding this, chronotherapeutics. Basically, our understanding when it's best to administer particular medication to correspond to the person's biological rhythm. So some examples of this: diazepam, a drug famous for anxiety, is absorbed faster when it's taken in the morning, and so that's now the guideline. Aspirin is prescribed to be taken at night. So typically heart attacks happen really early in the morning. And so if somebody takes aspirin last thing at night, it means that the blood is thinned overnight, therefore preventing heart attacks, which are likely to occur in the morning. So this means that research into circadian rhythms has really helped to increase the effectiveness of drug treatments and has helped to save lives. So not only is it really interesting, but it's having really strong and practical utility in the real world.